The title can be an opportunity to introduce an element of sound because it's a spoken aspect of the exhibition overall. And so I like the idea of busy signal as a phrase conveying a sound. I also, especially when all the paintings were together in my studio, noticed there was sort of like common thread where all the figures seemed preoccupied with their various tasks or activities and sort of turned away from the viewer. The images are purposely left open-ended to invite the viewer to apply their own experiences and interpretations to what the painting can represent, rather than having the figure collude with the overall image to present a very didactic, predetermined narrative. And that's sort of in the spirit of dialogical exchange as opposed to dialectical exchange, where you're sort of trying to negotiate one idea over another. I'm very interested in the ideas and experiences that the viewer is bringing to the image and what is being represented in the painting, sort of meeting at the same plane and interweaving to create something that's new or possibly more ineffable. Yeah, so I think the figures' bodies, shapes, not only can indicate compositional structure and like the direction in which the eye can move around the painting, but you can also think about the shapes that they're forming alongside the objects that they're interacting with as sort of creating like a type of something that would be analogous to a sound wave. So for instance, with taking it in, along with the sheet that's in front of the figure, it's kind of creating this jagged, almost star-like shape and expressing a type of urgency that's being conveyed through the narrative in that painting. And with pasting, where the figure is pushing the broom up and creating this very directional movement, it's sort of expressing an intentionality that participates in that task. And then with All My Might, with the crossbow, the combination of the tree, the figure, and the sort of bow and arrow create this almost zigzag line throughout, which can sort of be analogous to like the sound wave that's happening in the forest, and the idea that the figure in that instance is projecting their intention out, like more broadly. So within the works on paper, rather than having an entire figure miniaturized down into a smaller composition, I wanted to sort of like take different body parts and just sort of reduce it, like allow the body to become a bit more elemental and have the shapes of the hands and the face sort of become architectural and sort of form the structure of the space alongside whatever object or gesture they're being engaged with. The hands really are sort of emphasized insofar as they are at the extremity of the figure, so they're sort of the point at which the figures are meeting whatever other elements are occurring in the painting. That point of contact also can become a sort of segue of movement from one aspect of the composition into the next. A lot of my painter friends ask me about it because they're like, how do you use purple? It's sort of like this color that I think you have to find your way to. And it's incredibly useful because it can tonally shift to being very warm and very cool. And the paintings, because they're coming entirely from the sort of imagined and projected world, ultimately become unified by how the luminosity is appearing throughout the entire composition, and trying to use different shades of purple is a good way to express warm and cool tones within that. You know, I think part of what I like about the works on paper is that they feel like a project that's separate and distinct from the paintings. The paintings are very beholden and responding to the material of paint, and likewise I wanted the works on paper because it's a dry medium that can also achieve luminosity, I wanted the subjects and structures of those works to be in direct conversation with what that material can achieve. So for instance, when you're working with a dry medium, you can make very fine lines or make things appear very taut or sharp. So the subject and structure of those drawings is sort of selected particularly to correlate with that material. I think about the compositional requirements of a painting as being analogous to the compositional requirements of a song. So in my imagination, there are different types of sound that could be projected onto, for instance, more broad or flat areas of color versus like more stippled or dense patterning that also convey a type of speed or movement. So the sound or movement of a painting is like intentionally sped up or slowed down via this variation in mark making. I try to resist projecting language or labels onto the paintings in advance of beginning them. So I prefer to start with this sort of process of making these more intuitive, free associative sketches, and then almost more like a Rorschach test, trying to find images within these more abstract shapes. And then when I begin the painting is where I begin to build the space, the texture, the luminosity. But specifically with this painting was a bit of an outlier for that process. As I was beginning to prepare the works for this show, I came across a note that I had left myself maybe a year before that just said Botticelli Venus laundry line with no other information, and it felt sort of like a prompt or a challenge to try to come up with an image from that predetermined language. I wanted to pull elements of Birth of Venus into this more modern subject matter and playfully sort of conceal the figure's body with this billowing sheet, but then have the rose print pattern on the sheet, which you sort of see in like more contemporary bedding, be a reference to the floral cloth print in Birth of Venus, and the presence of the wind being articulated through the sort of blowing debris that's in the very foreground, and then the sort of more muted chain link fence echoing the way the waves are represented in the ocean in that painting. There were sort of like two different things happened before I began that painting that sort of like led to it. The first is that I had already completed the drawing, which represents a Greek vase being glued back together. And I thought it would be so great to take that subject of art restoration and scale it up and apply it to an oil painting. And I had also begun sort of exploring this technique of scumbling the paint to blend it in a way that's very like textured and directional. And so it made me think about the sort of woven threads of a tapestry all going in one direction. The sort of coalescence of those two disparate ideas sort of led me to think about what that technique could achieve and how I could integrate it with this idea of art restoration. And I thought that having a tapestry that specifically represented a hunting scene could also play with the painting that I made of a hunting scene, but using more contemporary tools and methods. For the pasting painting, the subject of torn posters sort of just came from like witnessing and experiencing that in my periphery as I'm moving through an urban environment. But particularly since the COVID lockdown, I noticed that a lot of the more sort of edgy, fun band posters were being represented by posters advertising like grocery delivery and things that were going to meet more domestic and immediate needs. And it made me think about the sort of perennial subject of fruit or still lives or flowers as sort of denoting the subject of art. Specifically for this show, I chose to have the works on paper act as pendants to a a couple of the paintings, so they could be a sort of accompaniment or sort of like an addendum to what the paintings are potentially representing or depicting. So in Summer Flowers, I had been imagining a flower shop where the bouquet is being wrapped in cellophane, and initially in that painting had wanted to include the neon flower shop sign, but there wasn't really anywhere that I could insert it. So I decided to make a separate drawing of that sign to sort of accompany it as a type of support. I think because there is only like really one painting that's sort of like, to my mind, utilizing the fourth wall insofar as it's sort of like, I'm thinking about Around the Block, the statue painting, where you sort of have like 3 parts of the scene represented around you, and then the audience gets to be the fourth wall that's sort of reflected in the like central figure that's like largest and to the left as sort of a stand-in for the viewer, like entering into the painting and almost being at the same scale of the viewer that's standing in front of it, as a way of sort of incorporating the outside world into the painting. I think also I like to think about the figures as feeling very elemental and simplified, particularly when they appear in the very foreground. So the overall structure of the painting is sort of dissolving and tapering as it comes further into the foreground, so that by the time it arrives at the viewer, it's sort of simplified to the extent that the viewer can enter into it and begin to rebuild the painting from their own perspective.